You were speeding in a school zone. That's a $200 fine, payable immediately. Judge Harold Denton barely looked up from the stack of papers in front of him, his tone clipped, dismissive, like he had already decided this case before it even started. His gavel tapped against the bench, signaling finality. Case closed. Catherine Parker, standing tall in the defendant's spot, didn't flinch. She crossed her arms, her voice even but firm. With all due respect, Your Honor, I wasn't speeding. I have evidence. Judge Denton sighed, waving a hand like he had heard the same excuse 100 times before. The court has already reviewed the case. Officer's testimony is clear. You were clocked at 45 miles per hour in a 20-mile-per-hour zone. That's it. A quiet murmur rippled through the small municipal courtroom. A few people shifted in their seats, exchanging glances. Most cases today had been routine. Traffic tickets, minor disputes, nothing out of the ordinary. But something about this exchange felt different. Catherine tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Then a soft chuckle escaped her lips, not of amusement, but of disbelief. She reached down, unlatched her sleek black briefcase, and pulled out a small leather ID case. With a flick of her wrist, it flipped open, and the bold gold lettering gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Assistant United States Attorney, District of Columbia. The courtroom went silent. The judge's gavel, frozen midair, hovered for just a second longer before lowering slowly onto the bench. His expression didn't change, not at first, but the way his fingers curled against the wood told a different story. I'm afraid you just fined a federal prosecutor, Your Honor, Catherine said, her voice steady, sharp. And I'd love to hear why you refuse to look at my evidence. For the first time that morning, Judge Denton hesitated. A single bead of sweat formed on his forehead, and his fingers twitched. Small, almost imperceptible movements, but Catherine caught them. She had seen it before. The exact moment when a person realized they'd made a mistake. A big one. And that was when everything started to unravel. It had started like any other morning. Catherine Parker stepped out of her apartment, the crisp Washington, D.C. air carrying the first hints of fall. She adjusted her suit jacket, took a slow sip of her coffee, black, no sugar, the way she always had it, and walked toward her car. Her mind was already deep in work mode. A major case was coming up, one that involved a powerful drug cartel with deep political ties. She had spent months building it, threading together evidence, mapping out connections. But right now, the only thing on her mind was getting to court on time. Traffic was its usual mess. Cars packed bumper to bumper, cyclists weaving through, parents dropping off kids at school. Catherine kept her eyes on the road, careful as she made her way through the school zone. A yellow school bus lumbered ahead of her, forcing her to keep a slow, steady pace. Then, flashing red and blue lights filled her rearview mirror. She frowned, pulled over. A tall officer approached her window, face impassive. His badge number gleamed under the morning sun, 6721. License and registration, ma'am. Catherine didn't hesitate. She reached into her glove compartment, pulled out her documents, and handed them over. What's the issue, officer? You were going 45 in a 20-mile-per-hour school zone. Catherine blinked. That's not possible. The officer barely glanced at her. It's correct, I clocked you myself. She inhaled sharply, keeping her tone controlled. I was behind a school bus the entire time. I couldn't have been going faster than 15 miles per hour. The officer exhaled, unimpressed. You can contest it in court. Just like that. No argument, no discussion. A simple declaration, final, unquestionable. Then came the scratch of pen against paper. A ticket, ripped off the pad and slapped onto her dashboard. Catherine stared at it for a moment. then at the officer. She knew how the system worked. She had seen people get steamrolled by it. And yet, something about this didn't sit right. She wasn't just going to let it slide. So, a week later, she walked into the small municipal courtroom, her briefcase in hand, her expression unreadable. She had evidence: dashcam footage, GPS logs, time-stamped bus route data. But as she sat, waiting for her case to be called, she noticed something. Judge Denton was moving through cases quickly. Too quickly. Dismissing some fines in an instant, hammering others with penalties that didn't quite seem fair. And, as she observed him, a quiet suspicion settled in the back of her mind. This wasn't about a speeding ticket. Something else was happening here. She just didn't know what yet. Catherine sat in the crowded municipal courtroom, her fingers tapping lightly against the leather of her briefcase. She wasn't nervous. She had spent years inside courtrooms, both grand and grimy, watching justice unfold in all its forms. But this wasn't justice. She watched as Judge Denton moved through case after case at an almost mechanical pace. A young man who had run a red light? Case dismissed. A woman with an expired registration? A mere warning. Then came a middle-aged man with a minor parking violation. He was hit with a maximum fine. Catherine frowned. The pattern wasn't obvious, but it was there. Some people were walking free without so much as a reprimand, while others, seemingly at random, were getting slammed with heavy penalties. And the judge's reasoning? He offered none. Then her name was called. She rose, adjusting the strap of her briefcase, and walked to the podium. Judge Denton barely looked up. "Miss Parker, you were caught speeding in a school zone. The officer's testimony is clear. Do you have anything to say before I issue the fine?" Catherine met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. "Yes, Your Honor. I have dashcam footage proving I was not speeding. The timestamp and GPS logs confirm that I never exceeded 15 miles per hour. We don't need to see that." Silence stretched through the courtroom. Catherine's jaw tightened. "With all due respect, sir, I insist." Judge Denton finally looked up from his papers, his expression blank, but his tone edged with finality. "I make the rulings here, Miss Parker. The fine stands, $200, payable immediately." A murmur rippled through the spectators. The judge had barely let her speak. Catherine took a slow breath, gripping the flash drive in her hand. "Your Honor, if you refuse to review exculpatory evidence, that is a violation of due process. I'd like to formally request a review of my case." Judge Denton's fingers twitched. "This is highly irregular." "No, Your Honor," she interrupted, her voice steady. "What's irregular is dismissing valid evidence without cause." The room was so quiet now that Catherine could hear the slight creak of the judge's chair as he leaned back. For the first time, his expression shifted, just a flicker of something. Then, before he could respond, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open. A man in a dark suit strode in, tall, broad shoulders, a badge clipped to his belt, just visible beneath his jacket. FBI. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, heads turning, whispers flitting from one person to the next. The agent moved straight to the court clerk, leaned in, and whispered something. The clerk's eyes widened. Then she turned to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice tight, "there's a federal investigator here to see you." Catherine didn't move, but inside, she knew. This wasn't about a traffic ticket anymore. She had just walked into something much, much bigger. The air in the courtroom grew thick, suffocating in its silence. Judge Denton's fingers hovered over his gavel, frozen mid-motion. The presence of the federal investigator had sucked the oxygen out of the room, turning what had been a routine municipal case into something far more dangerous. Catherine remained perfectly still, watching. studying. The agent moved with quiet authority, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor as he approached the bench. He didn't look at anyone else, just the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to speak. Now." Judge Denton swallowed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Catherine caught it. His grip tightened on the edge of his bench, his knuckles paling under the pressure. This is highly unusual," Denton stammered. He forced a tight-lipped smile, but it did nothing to mask the beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "We're in the middle of a court proceeding." The agent didn't blink. "It's urgent." Denton hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape, for some way to regain control, and for the first time, he found none. Catherine watched the cracks form. Just minutes ago, he had dismissed her case without hesitation, waved away her evidence as if it were meaningless. But now, with the FBI standing in his courtroom, his confidence was gone. Then, in a complete shift, his voice softened. Perhaps we were too hasty in dismissing your evidence, Miss Parker." The murmurs in the courtroom swelled. Catherine tilted her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. He was scrambling. This wasn't a reconsideration. It was desperation. The judge cleared his throat, shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling. "Yes, I believe it would be appropriate to take a short recess to review your case properly." A flicker of satisfaction crossed Catherine's face, but she masked it quickly. She had seen men like Denton before, powerful, untouchable in their own small domains, until they weren't. But what unsettled her wasn't his sudden reversal. It was the fear in his eyes. Judge Denton wasn't worried about her. He wasn't even worried about the fine. He was worried about something else, something bigger. And whatever it was, it had just walked through the doors of his courtroom. 2 weeks earlier, Catherine Parker sat in her office, eyes scanning line after line of financial records. The glow of her laptop screen cast sharp shadows across her desk, the only light in the room aside from the flickering city skyline outside her window. It was late, well past midnight, but she was too deep into this to stop now. The case she was building wasn't just another drug bust. It was bigger, dirtier, more dangerous. For months, the FBI had been tracking a powerful cartel operating within D.C., one that had managed to keep its hands clean despite funneling millions through the system. But Catherine knew the truth. Criminal organizations didn't thrive without protection, and this one had plenty of it. Inside law enforcement, inside politics, and, as she was beginning to suspect, inside the judiciary itself. She scrolled through sealed case files, dismissed charges, quietly dropped investigations. Each one led her deeper into the same pattern. Officers arresting known cartel members, only for their cases to mysteriously vanish before trial. And then she found it, buried under layers of bureaucratic paperwork, buried so deep that it seemed like someone had wanted it forgotten. One name stood out: Judge Harold Denton, the very same judge who had just tried to fine her over a traffic ticket. She exhaled slowly, fingers tightening around the edge of her desk. Denton had presided over multiple cartel-related cases in the last 5 years, and in every single one, the charges had been dismissed. No explanations, no public statements, just gone. A chill ran down her spine. She had spent her entire career fighting cases like this. Cases where the law wasn't the problem, but the people enforcing it. She had put corrupt cops behind bars, exposed bribes in the Senate, torn apart dirty financial networks. But this wasn't just another case. This was a system designed to protect itself, and she had just stepped right into it. Now, sitting in that courtroom, watching Judge Denton unravel in real time, she realized something else. Her ticket wasn't random. It was never about a school zone. Someone had put her name on a list. Someone had wanted her in this courtroom, and she was about to find out why. The weight in the courtroom shifted. The tension, once a subtle undercurrent, had thickened into something suffocating. Judge Denton's eyes darted to the FBI agent standing beside the clerk's desk. His fingers flexed against the gavel, as if debating whether to slam it down and reclaim control. But it was too late for that. Control had already slipped through his fingers. The room, once filled with mundane legal proceedings, had transformed into something else entirely. A battleground. Catherine watched the judge closely, every small movement, every flicker of emotion. He wasn't just rattled, he was trapped. Then, the inevitable happened. The agent took a step forward, his voice even. "Judge Denton, we need you to come with us." A ripple of shock spread through the courtroom. Gasps, whispers, a low murmur that quickly turned into a wave of hushed speculation. Judge Denton let out a sharp breath. He stopped himself, then forced a tight smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Surely, Agent, there's been some sort of misunderstanding." "There hasn't." The agent pulled out a folded document, held it up. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time since Catherine had stepped into this courtroom, Judge Denton looked small. His lips parted, his face drained of color. His fingers trembled as they gripped the bench, his knuckles whitening. He looked at Catherine then, but not with anger, not anymore, with fear. That's when she knew. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of whoever was pulling the strings. The bailiff hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, cuffs in hand. The gavel slipped from Denton's grip, landing against the wooden bench with a dull, final thud. A sound of defeat. Cameras flashed, phones rose. The courtroom, now fully awake to the gravity of the moment, watched as the judge who had once held power over this room was led away in cuffs, his steps unsteady, his face eerily blank. Catherine remained still. This should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. Because as she stood there, watching Denton disappear through the doors, one thought gripped her with icy certainty. If the cartel had been protecting him, then someone even more powerful had just decided he was expendable. And if they were willing to sacrifice a judge, just like that, then she knew one thing for sure. She was next. The night was deep and silent. The city outside Catherine Parker's office, a blur of distant headlights and the occasional wail of a siren. But inside, the only sound was the quiet hum of her laptop and the steady click of her keyboard. The judge was gone. Arrested. But that didn't mean the fight was over. If anything, it had only just begun. She leaned forward, eyes scanning through the records she had managed to pull. Dismissed cases, sealed files, court proceedings that never should have disappeared. Each one was a loose thread, and Catherine had spent her career pulling at those threads until the whole thing unraveled. And now, the same name kept appearing. Miguel Rivera. Not just a name, the name. The cartel kingpin who had turned entire cities into his personal chessboard. A ghost in the legal system. Every time someone got close to him, they either backed off or disappeared. Catherine's jaw tightened. 2 years ago, Rivera had been arrested on federal charges. Slam dunk case. The evidence had been airtight. He should have never seen daylight again. But then, Judge Denton had presided over the trial. And just like that, case dismissed. No reason, no appeals, no public record of why. She clicked on the file. Access restricted. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't just corruption. Someone had deliberately erased the details, sealed the case so tight that not even her federal clearance could break through. She tried again. Error. File does not exist. Her pulse picked up speed. This was different. Someone had been here before her. Someone had gone through the system and scrubbed it clean. A cold realization settled in her gut. She wasn't the one uncovering this conspiracy. She was chasing ghosts. The thought had barely solidified when her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated, then answered. For a second, there was nothing, just empty static. Then, a voice, low, unshaken, measured. "You need to drop this, Parker." Her grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" A pause. Then the voice spoke again, quieter this time. "You're already dead. You just don't know it yet." The line went dead. Catherine sat frozen. Her office, once a place of quiet concentration, now felt like a trap. The walls too close, the air too thin. She slowly set the phone down, her mind racing. This wasn't a warning. It was a promise. The city felt different tonight. Catherine Parker had always been aware of her surroundings. Years in law enforcement made sure of that, but now, every shadow felt like it was watching. Every passing car slowed just a little too much. Every reflection in a window sent a prickle of unease down her spine. She wasn't paranoid. She was being hunted. The call had been the first warning, the vanishing case files, the second. But this was the final proof. She wasn't just close to the truth. She was a problem that needed to be eliminated. Her fingers curled tighter around the steering wheel as she pulled into the underground parking garage beneath her apartment. The fluorescent lights flickered, buzzing faintly in the emptiness. She checked her mirrors. Nothing. No cars, no movement. Still, the unease didn't fade. She parked, cut the engine, and sat still for a moment, breathing through the tension coiling in her chest. Then she reached for her bag. Crack. The sharp pop of a suppressed gunshot shattered the silence, and before she could think, glass exploded beside her. She moved. Instinct took over. She threw herself sideways across the passenger seat as another shot punched through the driver's side window, embedding deep into the leather. Her heartbeat slammed in her ears. She hit the door handle, dropping low, and rolled onto the pavement, keeping the car between her and whoever was aiming to kill her. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to steady her breathing. No hesitation, no panic. She scanned the rows of parked cars, searching for an escape. Then, there, a reflection in the side mirror of a black sedan 3 spaces away. A man, dressed in dark clothing, gun raised, searching. She reached down, felt for the small Glock she kept strapped beneath her seat. But the moment her fingers brushed the grip, another shot rang out. The bullet skidded across the pavement inches from her hand. Her attacker wasn't just aiming to kill, he was toying with her. A message. She clenched her teeth, forcing herself to think. This wasn't random. This wasn't just about silencing her. Whoever had sent this man knew she would fight back. They wanted her to see them, to understand that this wasn't about Judge Denton anymore. The corruption stretched higher, much higher. Catherine exhaled sharply, then fine. If they wanted a fight, she would give them one. She counted down from 3, braced herself, and then she ran. She moved fast, weaving between cars, using them as cover. The shooter fired again, but she was already too low, too quick. She reached the concrete pillar near the stairwell, her back pressed against the cold surface, forcing herself to stay calm. A split second of silence. Then the echo of footsteps retreating. Whoever he wasn't here to finish the job. Not tonight. And that terrified her more than the gunshots. She waited, counting the seconds, listening. Then cautiously, she moved. Peering around the pillar, she caught the faintest glimpse of a dark SUV pulling out of the garage, tires screeching as it disappeared into the night. She stayed still, pulse hammering, eyes locked on the empty space where her attacker had stood. She could leave, walk away, cut her losses before this went any further. But then she remembered the files that had been erased, the judge who had crumbled before her eyes, the voice on the phone promising she was already dead. They had tried to bury the truth. Now she was going to dig it up. And this time, she wouldn't stop until she burned them all down. Catherine sat in the dim glow of her laptop screen, the weight of the past 24 hours pressing down on her like a vice. The bullet holes in her car, the erased files, the man who had tried and failed to kill her. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep her quiet, and now she knew why. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she pulled up the final piece of the puzzle. Bank transactions, wire transfers, hidden offshore accounts. It had taken hours of digging, tracking payments funneled through shell corporations that didn't officially exist. But there it was, a name, Mark Collins. Her breath hitched. Her boss, the man who had guided her career, who had told her to stay put when Denton was arrested. The one person in the federal system she had thought she could trust. He wasn't just involved, he was orchestrating it. The sinking feeling in her gut turned to something colder, sharper. She reached for her phone. Collins needed to answer for this, but before she could dial, her screen lit up. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. A voice, calm, controlled. "You've been busy, Catherine." She stilled. This wasn't Collins. It was deeper, more measured, and then something worse. "The president would like to see you." Her pulse slowed. They weren't sending hitmen. This time they were bringing her in. The meeting wasn't in the White House. It was in a private estate, one too elegant to be a safe house, too quiet to be a government facility. The kind of place where conversations happen that never made it into official records. Collins was there, waiting for her. He didn't look surprised. Catherine took a slow breath. "How long?" His expression didn't change. "Does it matter?" Her jaw clenched. Of course it mattered. But before she could speak, the doors opened, and he walked in. The President of the United States, the most powerful man in the country, and judging by the way he carried himself, a man who already knew exactly how this conversation was going to end. He took a seat, steepling his fingers. Then he simply said, "Let's not waste time." Catherine didn't move. The President studied her for a long moment, then exhaled. "You think you've uncovered something new, but you haven't. This has been in motion for years. The system isn't broken, Catherine. It works exactly as it was designed to." Her skin chilled. Collins leaned forward. "You have two choices." She already knew what was coming. The President continued, his voice calm. "You can walk away. New identity. New life. Forget all of this ever happened." She didn't blink. "And if I say no?" Collins sighed. "Then you don't leave this room." The silence stretched, heavy, suffocating. Catherine's heart pounded, but her face remained still. A choice. That's what they thought they were offering her. But she had made hers long before stepping into this room. So she let out a slow breath and nodded. "Fine," she said, voice unreadable. "I'll play the game." The President smirked, leaning back. Smart choice. Collins didn't smile. He knew her too well, because this wasn't surrender. This was strategy. And when the time came, she would burn them all down from the inside. The world believed Catherine Parker was dead. The news broke just days after her meeting with the President. A car accident, high speed, instant impact, no survivors. The headlines ran with it, the official reports sealed. A tragic loss, a brilliant prosecutor gone too soon. But there was no accident. There was no body, because Catherine Parker wasn't dead. She had simply disappeared. Somewhere deep in the system, buried beneath layers of classified documents and erased identities, she existed under a different name, with a different role. No longer a prosecutor, no longer a threat. At least that's what they thought. The truth? She was closer to them than ever. For months, she moved in silence, weaving herself into the very machine she had once fought against. Gaining access, watching, learning. The secrets they had spent years protecting, she now had them in the palm of her hand. She walked the halls of power with a quiet smile, shaking the hands of the same people who had tried to have her killed. They believed they had turned her, that she had seen the futility of fighting back. But they had miscalculated, because she wasn't playing their game. She was setting the board for her own. One day, when the moment was right, she wouldn't just expose them. She would burn it all down. Not just the cartel, not just the politicians who sold their souls, the entire system. And this time, there would be no one left to stop her. If you think corruption is just a conspiracy theory, think again. The truth is often buried, hidden in plain sight, protected by those in power. Catherine Parker's story may be fiction, but the reality? It's happening every day. So ask yourself, how much of what you see is real? How deep does the corruption go? And most importantly, when the time comes, will you be ready to fight back? If this story gripped you, like, share, and subscribe, because the truth deserves to be told.